The sky over Ashland that day wore the color of old paper. Muted, thin, the kind of gray that made every shadow look like a memory. I kept thinking of that as I stood on the gravel outside the church, the hem of my coat dragging in damp, and watched the people. I called family rehearse grief like a scene. They had been polishing for years. They smiled for the phones the way actors smile for opening nights. They arranged their faces, angled their chins, practiced the right amount of dampness in their eyes. It was a performance so deliberate it made my stomach clench. My name is Emily Reyes. I am the school nurse at Ashland Elementary, and I had been Granny, Mae's shadow for the last 5 years, the one who'd bring her coffee when the kettle clicked off, who sat with her on slow Tuesday afternoons and listened as she sorted her pearls and cigarette cards in the little papers she kept folded in tiny, neat stacks. Granny Mae taught me how to mend a sock properly, how to make a lemon pie with a crackless crust, how to sit very still when someone's sorrow needed space to breathe. She taught me about the worth of silence. I was grieving in a way that felt honest and raw. Every chest-tight breath was a reply to a woman who had taught me how to be human. But my grief wasn't theatrical. It wasn't something you could filter with 5 different Instagram stories and an obligatory, in loving memory graphic. The people clustered near the church doors, my Aunt Victoria in a sharp navy coat, her husband Charles with a camera hanging like an accessory, my cousin Brooke, whose lipstick was the exact color of control, kept adjusting the scene as a director might. Their laughter leaked out in little, brittle bursts when they thought no one was watching. They debated the floral arrangements, then the funeral bill, then inevitably the will. I stood apart and watched them watch themselves. I felt like a single camera in a crowd of mirrors, recording everyone but nobody, really recording anything of value. Inside the lawyer's office, the air smelled faintly of lemon oil and old books. Mr. Hargrove cleared his throat and did the client-sounding things lawyers do. He shuffled papers with ceremonial slowness, folded his hands, looked meaningfully at the family. He had a polite, practiced smile that made his eyes look tired in that not unpleasant way people get when they have seen 1,000 arguments and know the contours of them all. "The will is explicit," he said. "Granny Mae has left the entirety of her estate, real estate, investments, the private trust fund, and personal effects, to Emily Reyes." A silence fell so thick it felt like a physical object. I remember the way the air seemed to press against my ears, the way the fluorescent light buzzed a different pitch. A clock ticked, a long, slow sound that marked the boundary between before and after. I could feel the family's shock like a gust of wind trying to blow me over. Then the performance changed, like a stagehand switching out props. The faces around me transformed from practiced solemnity to something raw and sharpened. Aunt Victoria's jaw cut out hard and cold. "This is impossible," she said. "There has to be a mistake. Mae wouldn't. She wasn't of sound mind." A cousin? Tyler? Adam? Names blurred together like they were typed in all caps, rose and began to rant about manipulation. "How did you get her to do this?" he hissed at me, a handsprings of suspicion and accusation. You must have leaned on her." It was as if they were drawing a dagger out of thin air and handing it to me. I opened my mouth to say it wasn't true. There are things you can say about love that feel small when said aloud. Granny Mae loved me. She sat me at her kitchen table and taught me trajectories of stars. She folded my shirts when I came for the holidays and tucked a coin into my pocket when I left. She watched me sleep on the couch and smoothed my hair with a thumb like a benediction. I tried to find the breath to tell them this, and all I could taste was metal and old coffee. They accused me of being a liar, of pressuring her, of taking advantage. They asked about the will's legitimacy loudly enough that Mr. Hargrove's polite expression became a grade A display of mingled boredom and annoyance. "We will be examining the circumstances," Victoria said. "Of course we will be, for the record." She reached for her phone with practiced gravity. She dialed like a woman who had rehearsed outrage and could list the media she'd call in order with her eyes closed. I left the lawyer's office in a fog that smelled faintly of lemon and old money. The rain had started up again in small, precise droplets that left the world looking as if it had been washed but not dried, clean and a little stunned. For a moment I stood by my car and let the rain find the seams of my coat, let it draw lines down my face that could be mistaken for tears. People like my Aunt Victoria were efficient with grief the way they were efficient with their hair, styled, packaged, and ready to sell. They wanted to put me on a stage and prove I was a fraud. They wanted to perform law and morality like a duet. They thought the audience, the neighbors, the bank, the small-town papers, would tip toward them because scandal is always delicious. They thought money would make the truth pliable. That's when things became less like a play and more like a slow, aggressive tide. Over the next week, my phone became an instrument of siege. Messages arrived like grenades, texts from strangers claiming to know Granny Mae better than I did, emails that suggested hidden mental incapacity, a smear on a local blog accusing me of preying on a vulnerable elder. My landlord, who had been polite and reasonable the day I moved in, called with a new tone and asked if I could pay next month's rent up front. The family said that was coincidence. The person who owned the blog called it concern for the town. My landlord's voice sounded smaller, frightened in a way that made me feel exposed. On a Wednesday night, I packed a single bag. I left behind my handful of possessions in the one-bedroom apartment I rented above a bakery. A stack of overdue library books, the plant I'd managed not to kill, a photograph of Granny Mae and me at a 4th of July picnic, where she had insisted on wearing a purple hat. I took the keys to my car and drove the 2 hours north to the house Granny Mae had described to me, the first time she'd invited me as her beneficiary in training. That small, stubborn place on the edge of the Oregon coast, a house she called the last honest thing she owned. The house sat like a secret between sea-scented hills and a narrow spit of beach, its shingles the color of smoked salt. A low fence ran along the perimeter, and hydrangeas, too huge in their blue, like small, obstinate hands, bloomed in a reckless, unapologetic way by the path. When I turned the key in the old brass lock, the house smelled like lemon and lavender and old wool, a smell that could undo a day and make you want to believe in gentleness all over again. "Emily," said Mr. Ramirez from the kitchen doorway, a man who had been the estate manager for more than 30 years. He moved like someone who had always measured his steps to the rhythm of another person's memory. His hair was silver at the temples, his palms wide and firm. "You made it." He used the present perfect like a benediction. He'd been expectant and watchful since the funeral, a quiet pillar. Beside him, Diane, Granny Mae's friend since she was a girl, a woman with a face like a story, offered me a mug and a look that made my teeth ache with gratitude. "We knew you would come," she said, with a kind of unapologetic certainty. On the table, neatly arranged, were stacks of ledgers, an old daytimer, and a weathered box full of cassette tapes labeled in grapevine handwriting. There was also Charles, who introduced himself as a financial advisor, a man with a conservative suit and an easy, controlled manner. "Granny Mae planned these things," he said, thumbing through a ledger. "She was careful. She was surgical. She left this to you deliberately." "I know she did," I said. My voice sounded like someone else's. Grief had already hollowed it into something cautious, some narrow instrument. "She told me she wanted me to have it. She said she knew me." "We all loved her," Diane said softly. "But Mae, she knew how to pick people." Mr. Ramirez led me to Granny Mae's study. It was a room with windows that watched the ocean, and the light fell in stripes across the floor like a film negative. Bookshelves cradled stories, volumes with spines that had seen hands. A desk held a green banker's lamp and a box with a leather strap. That box contained journals, heavy, dog-eared, each entry a thread of Mae's life scribbled in small, precise handwriting. We sat for a long time, reading the slow logic of someone who had watched the world change and kept meticulous notes. I read about a marriage that had turned into a ledger of favors owed, of a family whose affections were measured in percentages and balance sheets. I read notes where Mae kept track of family dinners that had turned into heists of attention, conversations that had been less about sharing and more about harvesting. There were names, Victoria, Charles, Brooke, followed by small notations that read like inventory numbers. She had also filmed things. Hidden in the study's bottom drawer, under a stack of tax returns, were tapes, mini DV tapes with dates going back decades. I had never seen my Granny Mae like this, not just as the woman with a pie, dish on her lap, but as an archivist of the family's truth. She recorded conversations at dinners. She recorded meetings that smelled of polite betrayal. She recorded hands moving across ledgers. The tapes were clumsy, shaky, personal devices of justice. We played them on an old TV in the den, a clunky set that turned static into a companion. The first tape was a breakfast conversation from 2 summers ago, when my Aunt Victoria had been in town, and the family had gathered like a knot to be untied. Victoria spoke about investments, about the family trust, about keeping things in the family. She laughed at some point at a joke about obligations, a small, easy sound. On the tape, she said, not even trying to be clever, "We mustn't let outsiders get their hands on what we've built." It would tear the lineage apart. The footage stung because it was small and undeniable. Victoria's laugh, Charles' quiet counting of plates, Brooke's shifting of her handbag as if it were a symbol and a safe. There was nothing theatrical about the recordings. They were domestic, banal, the kind of evidence that pried open a life with a dentist's tool. As the days passed, the family's attacks open-ended like a list of grievances. Victoria's lawyer demanded access to the house. Brooke posted a cloying video of herself at the funeral. "We are all heartbroken," she mouthed. In the comments, the town gossiped and took sides. A rumor began that Granny Mae had been incompetent when she made her will. Another said there were signatures forged. One of my cousins, Ryan, I think, threatened to file a suit claiming undue influence. The town's small paper published an op-ed asking where the responsibility was, where the ethics of family lay when money was involved. But Granny Mae, in her odd, stubborn genius, had an answer for everything. She had not simply left me money. She had left me a team. Mr. Ramirez had keys, contacts, and a loyalty forged from a long apprenticeship. Diane knew the town like a seamstress knows. Pattern, she knew who owed favors and who kept secrets. Charles, the financial advisor, carried portfolios and knowledge of the ledger's muscles. And perhaps most importantly, there was Paige, Granny Mae's old attorney, a woman with a voice like a file drawer snapping shut and the capacity to turn paper into protection. They called themselves my camp. I found that the English language lacked a certain vocabulary for people who walked into your life and refused to let others dismantle it. I felt like an island suddenly remembered in a map of dead things. But they were there. Mr. Ramirez showed me the ledgers that proved transfers from corporate accounts to personal ones, the canceled checks with signatures that didn't quite match the ones in the bank's records. Charles revealed evidence of large withdrawals from accounts, records lit up with strange beneficiaries. Paige dug into corporate filings and found a shell company in Delaware that funneled payments like a secret pipeline. We began to file. Not retaliations in the pettiness sense, but legal anchors, emergency injunctions, notices to banks, calls to probate. Paige moved with the clinical speed of someone who had fought with the law and seen its edges and knew how to wedge them into place. She moved not like a lawyer who loved rulings, but like someone who loved the people who needed rulings. When Victoria's lawyer filed a paper alleging incapacity, Paige countered with a mountain of documentation, medical records, notarized letters Granny Mae had written, the tapes, the ledgers. She put together a narrative that was not scandalous but stubbornly lucid. Meanwhile, the family's social campaign escalated. My name trended locally, an ugly, small storm. My photograph appeared next to speculative headlines. Who is Emily Reyes, the mystery beneficiary? People in town stopped being gentle in passing. The woman at the grocery store, who had always given me an extra peach if she saw me buying one, offered barely a nod now. Children at the school whispered. I work with kids. They made me think of how rumor can be a sticky, invasive mold. Still, the greater part of the town remained curious rather than cruel. Real cruelty needed authors, and the authors were sometimes exhausted by their own scripts. At the house, the tapes continued to do the work of truth. We found a hidden stash of letters where family members thanked one another for loans that were not loans but embezzlements. There were photographs of my aunt signing papers with the kind of flourish that people use to make theft look like agreement. There were taped conversations, one where Charles and another cousin discussed buying off a trustee, There were receipts in the handwriting of people who would claim later they didn't know anything. We had the artifacts of complicity, signed receipts, endorsed checks, transcriptions. When Victoria and a handful of cousins came to the house one evening, it was with the expectation that a show of force would break us. They came not as mourners, but as marauders, suits bright as exclamation points. Their drivers' cars idling like small protests along the lane. They knocked on the front door with the sort of righteous indignation that wears itself like light armor. "We demand access to the property," Victoria said, voice threaded with the finality of someone seeking to close down a conversation. "We have a right to inspect Mae's affairs. There are irregularities here, and we will not be." "You will not be doing anything," said Paige in that voice of hers that closes. "Possibilities with the authority of a well-placed seal. You will, if you proceed, be seen in court. You will be judged by evidence, not by gossip." They tried to force their way in. They claimed an urgent right to retrieve family heirlooms. One of them reached for a framed photograph on the hallway wall, and Mr. Ramirez caught his wrist with the kind of muscle memory that comes from years of working to protect something devoted and precarious. The man's face reddened. He called the shoving provocation. The story quickly morphed into a pageant of victimhood. The moment they walked out of the house, they threatened us. They assaulted us. We were denied. We had taped pages, ledgers, and the local press was slowly beginning to sniff. Paige filed for a temporary restraining order. The judge, an older woman with a soft voice and, paradoxically, a face that made you feel like a bank where truth could be deposited, granted it. "There is probable cause," she said, reading the documents with the solemnity of someone reading a poem carefully, "and there is enough here to at least pause your relatives." That pause bought us a week. During that week, the tide shifted. People I had not expected to ally with me arrived at the cottage in small cluster. There was a retired accountant who'd once worked for Victoria's company and had the mild manner of someone with a ledger tattooed into his brain. He brought photocopies that matched our evidence. A woman who used to be my Granny Mae's housekeeper knocked on the door and, through tears, confessed to being paid in cash by people who later claimed they had nothing. A former business partner of Victoria's, someone who had left the company in anger, came forward with contracts that bore Victoria's signature in the margins where she had promised not to. The town paper ran a side-by-side of signatures, and the evidence was ugly and dull and real. It was a slow undoing, not a neat reveal. Real change in small towns is like a glacier. Incremental and then suddenly, cataclysmic. The press came in small bursts. A reporter from the state paper took more than an afternoon and asked questions that were not designed to titillate but to understand. "If these documents are accurate," she said, "what does this mean for how long this family has been moving money around under the table?" I answered the way you answer when the truth is in your bones. It means the truth is always simpler than our stories. People will complicate it, but a record is a record. The public confrontation came on a Saturday in June, when the sky over the house was clear and precise, the kind of summer sky that made the hydrangeas look almost obscene in their confidence. A crowd had gathered, neighbors with faces like cross-sections of the town, reporters with handheld recorders, people who had known my Granny Mae before she was famous for this last generous act. The family arrived like a second wave. They had hired a PR person. Their faces were trained to seem open and wronged. Victoria carried a small stack of paper that she waved like incense. "This is an assault," she called out into the crowd, her voice thin with cultivated hurt. "My sister, my mother, was not of sound mind." The accusation hung there like a thrown glove. I stepped forward because the house behind me had the kind of integrity that makes you feel small and enormous at the same time. I spoke in the voice I use when I explain to a scared second grader that lungs are supposed to be loud sometimes. "Granny Mae chose me," I said. "She was not incompetent. She was methodical. She planned for this. She filmed it. She gave everything to me because she trusted me to keep what she thought mattered alive." It would have been easy to use the language of triumph then, to say, "We won," or "The truth prevailed." But truth is a clumsy thing to win with, like a new instrument you don't know to play again. What steadied me was not the money and the trust, not the house's shingles, but the people who had shown up because they too wanted the honest thing to be honest. The house's old friends had their own reasons to speak. Loyalty, resentment, a love worn into grooves by years. They told stories, small, human things that made the will feel more like an act of faith than a check. A woman from the beach association, someone who had fought Granny Mae and lost arguments about dune preservation, came forward and told the crowd about how Mae had once spent her own money to save a stretch of sand from development. An old fisherman told a story about the careful way Mae had covered him with a blanket when he fell asleep on her porch. Little recollections became a lattice, and the family's argument looked smaller, its rage like a paper boat in a harbor. My team, Mr. Ramirez, Diane, Charles, Paige, stood near me, their faces the kinds of faces you trust more than polished ones, because they look like they remembered to worry. The press listened. The neighbors listened. The crowd made its decision the way a jury might when it feels the seams of a story pull and it can choose what to hold. They chose me. In the end, the legal fights didn't happen in a single cinematic courtroom blow. They were long and bureaucratic. They involved accountants and depositions, lines of small print you could drown inside, but the tapes and the ledgers were stubborn, and the town did not so easily forget the old woman, who had been generous to people, who had never expected to receive anything. The suit alleging incapacity was dismissed when the judge reviewed the medical records and the notarized statements and saw the pattern of method and mindfulness in Granny Mae's planning. The probability of fraud ebbed under the weight of evidence and old alliances. And the family, Victoria, Brooke, Tyler, came to understand that the money could not be bent into absolution. Some of them left the town or left my life with the bruised dignity of people who had been shown a mirror they did not want to clean. Others returned later, a little quieter. Their anger softened into a sort of embarrassed concession. There were conversations later, hesitant, awkward, where Victoria tried to explain that she had been frightened. "Money is a language of power," she said once, voice softer than I had ever heard. "I thought I could... I don't know." "To do what?" I asked, though I had the answer. She wanted control. She wanted the safety the ledger promised. She wanted to preserve family reputation like a varnish. "I thought I could keep us together," she said. "I thought I could protect it." "You tried to buy protection with a ledger," I said. "You forgot that protection is a kind of care." In the end, the estate was not just an amount in a bank. My life, like the story of the town, was altered by proof waiting, in the desk drawer and the courage of people willing to stand, to reveal, to remember. I used the trust dispassionately and carefully. Granny Mae had, in her way, been specific. She wanted the house preserved and opened, once a month for a community workshop. She wanted a fund created for the school where I worked, to make sure the kids had warm coats and a place to eat when weekends were hard. She left a sum to Diane so she could finally retire with dignity. She left me enough to stop renting, to buy a small house with its own stubborn hydrangeas, and to fund the projects she had loved without having them buried in probate or grift. But she left me more than money. She left me a kind of moral infrastructure, friendships that were stake-bearing, alliances that were real because they had been tested. She had been meticulous about whom she trusted. She had not been naive. I realized then that the inheritance included an instruction manual for living. Be attentive. Document the small betrayals before they scale into large ones. Keep your friends close and your receipts closer. On the night after the final hearing, I walked down to the beach. The moon was a slice of silver, and the tide came in with the slow, inevitable patience of a person who knows what it is like to wait. The house behind me hummed with the sleeping breaths of people who had come to guard what was true. The hydrangeas breathed in the moonlight and seemed to nod as if in approval. I sat on the cool sand and listened. The town had its divides, its small cruelties, and its large, weary kindnesses. I had learned that the people who perform grief are not always hypocrites. Sometimes they are people who have spent their lives learning the language of appearances, because appearances for them are currency. But I had also learned that currency cannot always buy the loyalty of someone who loves you without ledger. In the months that followed, small things stitched themselves back together. The school used Granny Mae's fund to start a program that kept kids dry and found lunches for long weekends. We planted a community garden in the field behind the school, and the students grew tomatoes that tasted like sunlight. Diane and Mr. Ramirez taught a weaving class at the house. Kids came with their hands dirty and left with laughter. Paige visited occasionally and would sit on the porch with a thermos, and tell me stories about being a young lawyer and getting up at dawn to read filings with a coffee-stained notebook. Sometimes, in the quiet moments just before dawn, I would sit at Granny Mae's kitchen table with a mug of tea and play one of the tapes, not to gloat or to savor revenge, but to hear the sound of a woman who had been unafraid to record a truth when everyone else wished to let it slide. Granny Mae's voice was small on those tapes, but also unyielding. "Keep the receipts, Em," she'd say to me once, laughing. "People are slippery. You keep your friends close and your paper closer." I understood then that the money had been secondary to the larger inheritance. She'd given me the knowledge that I was not helpless. She had taught me that dignity could be an active practice. Her legacy, the one that mattered in the marrow, was the idea that the truth does not always roar. Sometimes it sits in a corner with a cassette tape and waits for someone courageous enough to press play. I am not naive. I know that there are injustices we cannot solve with ledgers alone, that money behaves like weather and can erode as easily as it can build. But I also know I was given a rare gift, an immediate community ready to defend the honest thing, and a pile of documents that proved malice was often a craft disguised as care. At the end, when the town had made its small decisions, when the papers stopped printing my name like an accusation and began, slowly, to note me as a benefactor, I walked the path to the house and felt the shingles under my palm. The sea hissed. The hydrangeas shivered. The house was no longer just a place. It was a lighthouse built for a particular kind of weather, the kind that comes when people try to sell your courage for a price. Granny Mae had left me money, yes, but also a map of the people who would stand by me and the stories that proved it. She had given me power, to be sure, but also a more important thing: the right to keep what is honest. The town will gossip, and sometimes it will be unkind. But what I learned in those months, reading journals, watching tapes, hearing the tedious, necessary rumble of depositions, and seeing the small kindnesses of neighbors, is that truth, like the tide, is patient. It gathers its strength in unseen places, and then arrives in a roaring, inevitable wave. When the last of the legal filings closed, I held a small gathering at the house. I invited the people who had believed, who had shown up with photocopies, with witness statements, with casseroles and condolences. We sat around the long table in Granny Mae's kitchen, and someone, Diane probably, brought out an old lemon pie and a stack of mismatched plates. We ate until our tongues were full of sugar and the sound of other people's laughter. I thought of Granny Mae then, of her hands folded like a benediction, and I felt the quiet, immense joy of being trusted. She had known what she was doing. She had, with surgical empathy, set the stage for me to be more than a beneficiary. She had given me a role: guardian, steward, teller of the truth. Sometimes I still play the tapes at night, not because I need proof anymore, but because I like to hear her voice, measured, just a little defiant. Once, in a recording, she laughed and said, "They always think they can outmaneuver a woman who keeps her notes." No, I whisper back to the darkroom sometimes, like a reply to a ghost. They can't. The inheritance was never about the house alone. It was about those small, steady things that build a life: fidelity, the refusal to be erased, the courage to keep receipts, and the generosity to give when giving meant making enemies. I had the money to do good with, certainly, but I had also been given the extraordinary assurance that I was not alone. And in a little paper town like Ashland, where storms come and gossip flutters like strange birds, someone was finally watching with me,